So, we're not tearing the country apart. What transgender people are trying to accomplish is securing the rights that we have been born into as United States citizens born within the United States, or naturalized citizens who have come to this country and accepted citizenship. That's what we are dealing with. We are trying to level the playing field of rights. Just a couple more minutes, folks. Why are you trans meeting such resistance? Because of westernized Christian worldview influencing almost all areas of civil discourse. All right, folks, let's get started. I know that this is a topic that is very controversial. I know that people debate this and discuss this and really do fight against the language of genocide when talking about what is happening currently in the United States and in other places around the world when it refers to the transgender identified communities. For about the next 2 hours, I'm going to be looking at and discussing this subject matter. Genocide is something that we are all too familiar with, especially if you study history, especially if you study current events. There are multiple genocidal movements that are happening right now in the world, and there is very little discussion about those on the surface. We're not talking about the genocides that are happening right now around the world. If you take just even one real quick look at genocides that are happening right now, Darfur, Rwanda. Well, these are not right now. Let me get the... the Rohingya in Myanmar. The Nur and other ethnic groups in South Sudan. Christians and Yazidis in Iraq and Syria. Christians and Muslims in Central African republics, the Darfuris in Sudan, and the Uyghur in China. All of these are current, now existing genocides that are happening. There was some talk about Darfur some time ago, but that language has pretty much gone silent. The conversation about these things happening has gone silent because it's not pertinent enough and relevant enough to generate interest in a news cycle. So genocides do not get discussed, and therefore they are allowed to continue to happen. This is not something that went away with the Second World War. Just because we identified a genocide that happened during the Second World War does not mean that we ended it as a world community. They still happen. In fact, the United Nations has established very clear definitions of what constitutes a genocide. According to the Genocide Convention that was drafted in 1948 in the United Nations, a genocidal event is defined as any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily and mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, any of the following acts defines genocide. Any of those 5 different acts is part of the description of, and it is the entirety of a definition of a genocidal movement against a group of people. So when we are talking about genocide today, the United Nations guides us on what the definition of genocide is. Now, there are so many people who want to say, but genocide, where are people being killed? That is only one act out of 5 that defines genocide. The genocide that we are talking about in terms of what is happening around the world today now fits within the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. The existence of this definition gives us the beginning place to talk about the impact of genocide on the transgender community. But before we get into that, I want to continue to talk a little bit about what we see when we, what does it take to really look at something and say a genocide is happening. The one person who is getting a lot of attention on this very subject is, just 1 minute, let me grab his name because my brain doesn't hold this information. Because I want to give people the information to actually look this up. Dr. Gregory H. Stanton. Dr. Gregory H. Stanton began back in the 1990s to study genocides that have happened in the past, and he began to see patterns that emerged. The patterns that he saw that emerged revealed to him a process by which something moves from simple acts of discrimination to complete acts of genocide. The study that Dr. Stanton did helped him produce what he calls the 10 stages of genocide. Now, that is slightly a misnomer, especially in today's culture. I want to read to you from the paper, The Logic of the 10 Stages of Genocide by Dr. Stanton. He said, in my studies of genocide, I discovered that the process of every genocide has predictable stages or processes. After studying the history of the Holocaust, the Armenian Genocide, the Cambodian Genocide, and other genocides, in 1987 I developed a model known as the 10 Stages of Genocide. I regret using the term stages because the word implies linearity. The process of genocides aren't linear because they usually operate simultaneously. I should have simply called the stages processes, but there is a logical order to them. The processes are logically related to each other. Again, that is Dr. Gregory Stanton who came up with the 10 processes of genocide. In discussing what happens that gets us into something that is defined as a genocide, it is helpful to look at the processes that Dr. Stanton identified. And that is where this list comes into play. These are the 10 processes, or the entirety of a movement toward genocide. As Dr. Stanton said, these are not linear. These are not a checklist, meaning that you have to check one off before moving to another. That is not what happens. Many of these happen simultaneously. Many of these occur at such a time so that it is obvious that there is an intentional effort to do something. And if we can identify the majority of these events happening in an organized and systemic way, we can begin to talk about a genocidal movement happening, which refers us back to what the United Nations said about genocide and the defining of it in those 5 forms. If we begin to account for most of these happening at any particular time in history, we can see a movement toward a genocide, and the United Nations helps us clarify that. In terms of dealing with the subject of whether or not transgender people should be included or excluded in the definition of genocide, we do have to deal with one very simple issue of definition. When we talk about the United Nations definition, when we talk about how the United Nations uses genocide, there is one part of this that is really problematic, and that is genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Now, that in and of itself would limit the definition of genocide so that it does not include transgender people. But if we extend the understanding of genocides can happen to an identified group of people, that would include LGBTQ plus individuals, as well as transgender and non-binary individuals and groups specifically. For example, in Uganda, there is an increase in hostility and violence toward LGBTQ plus individuals simply because the legislature passed a bill. It is yet to be signed into law by the president, but the bill would criminalize the existence of transgender and other LGBTQ people. It offers up to 20 years in prison for just being a part of the LGBTQ plus community. We are seeing executions in some countries. We see the death penalty that is levied against individuals. We have seen life imprisonment. When we are talking about the idea of a genocide, and we are discussing this, we have to recognize that we are on the cusp of outdated definition. So when the United Nations says that genocide applies to a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, that is a definition of organizational efforts against those identified groups. What we have seen in the last about 15 years is a movement toward members of the LGBTQ plus community. And what we are seeing right now in many places around the world is a targeted attack on transgender communities. When I talk about transgender communities, I'm talking about the wider umbrella as well as just those who are identified as binary transgender people. The wider umbrella of transgender identified and non-binary identified people includes non-binary, agender. It includes drag performers. It includes gender non-conforming, gender queer individuals. It's a wide spectrum. It also includes indigenous understandings of gender that extend beyond the binary of man-woman. So when I discuss the idea of transgender non-binary community and the targeting of some of these processes, we are looking at a group of people who have not yet been identified by the United Nations as vulnerable to these efforts, but we are watching the very same processes being applied to those people, and we do see in the United Nations definition the very acts of what defines genocide. I hope this gives you a better understanding that genocide is not just the extermination of large groups of people. That can be a mass killing. When we talk about genocide, there is a different process that gets us through that movement from peaceful coexistence to extermination. There are many different points along the way where we begin to see that this is not just simply, we don't like this group of people. This is not just, we are not going to accept this group of people, or we're not going to cohabitate with this people, coexist with this people in this same space. These processes are an intentional effort to remove that group from existence within that space. So, there are a lot of people who come into my lives and they see this backsplash, and the minute they do, the first thing they say is, who's being killed? Where are the mass graves? How many are dying? The reality is that the legal definition of extermination is inadequate when talking about societal moves to remove individuals or communities from that society. It does not necessarily mean that it is a direct extermination. There are steps that are preceding the eventual extermination of individuals. So how does this impact the transgender community? So I want to go back to how the United Nations defines genocide. Genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part. There are 5 different acts that the United Nations recognize as genocide. Killing members of the group, which is the most obvious definition. It is the most clearly understood. It is also a part of the process that is developed in getting to genocide. But secondly, is causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. When we take a step back and we begin to look at what is happening in the United States today, we are watching a group of people systematically put laws in place that would commit serious harm, bodily and mentally. We have seen through legislation in the United States, and I am going to focus on the United States because that is what I'm most clearly understanding of. We see laws within the United States that deny the existence of peer-reviewed, proven and effective methods Bills that reject that in light of advancements that have been made. What they want to do is they want to return to an older understanding of the experience of transgender people when their experience was pathologized. They want to return to a time when transgender people were declared mentally ill. By the way, that is why we do not have as much scientific study on
Hey,
transgender
Jamie.
people. Mental illness was not given the same level of scientific inquiry that other illnesses might be or other personal experiences may be given. So, this group of people in the United States is writing laws that do not reflect the most current, adopted, and used standards of treatment to return
What?
to an earlier time of pathologizing the experience of transgender people. They are removing access to those treatments that are being used to create a better quality of life for transgender people. And I know there are many people who want to say, but suicidality rates. Yes, I agree. Suicide rates are definitely higher and steady when it comes to looking at
Oh,
transgender non-binary populations.
hold on.
What we do is we look at the total
Uh,
number of outcomes.
hold on. What the?
Whenever we talk about suicidality rates as a whole, we take it as a whole without looking at the paths that come into
Okay, is that
play
any
and what
better?
leads a person to that point. When individuals do not have access to gender affirming
Uh,
care, suicidality is linked to the psychic pain that an individual
what?
experiences because of
Oh,
dysphoria. Not all transgender and non binary individuals experience dysphoria, but for some, it gets worse over time. It increases to the point that they see no hope and they despair. And because they cannot access gender affirming care, whether that is because the access is not available or that they have societal or social reasons that they cannot do it, that despair leads to a choice. And that choice is terminal. But for those people who do have access to gender affirming care, who are able to receive that, that sense of dysphoria is decreased. The psychic pain resulting from the dysphoric experience is diminished. Internally, transgender people, non binary people, are more accepting of themselves and they are more at peace with who they are in terms of that sense of dysphoria. It is diminished. What impacts those who can access gender affirming care are societal pressures, are family interactions and acceptance, are those issues that are an external force telling them that they are not accepted among the rest of the population. For individuals who have access to gender affirming care, while their own sense of well being for themselves is increased, their ability to connect and relate to the rest of society is hindered by the message that they are not valid. The messages that we see, and I'm going to talk about these in just a little bit when I get to the 10 processes. The messages that we see currently, right now, regarding transgender identified individuals and groups is dehumanizing, invalidating, pathologizing, and it spurs a sense of hopelessness. The messages are repeated over and over and over again. And those who are exposed to that on a regular, ongoing basis without adequate care will continue to spiral downward into despair. The suicidality rates of transgender and non-binary individuals who have access to gender-affirming care is not because of a decrease in dysphoria. It is present because of an increase or a lack of access to adequate care to counteract societal efforts to invalidate. Nothing hurts worse than feeling like you're alone, unwanted, undesired. Nothing hurts worse than having someone tell you that you are not a full human being because of your experience. We are seeing legislation that is causing serious bodily and mental harm to members of the transgender community. The legislation is creating psychic pain. Third, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life. The removal of gender-affirming care from minors and adults will bring about physical destruction. It may not be an intentional effort with jackbooted thugs wandering through the streets trying to find a guy in a dress. But if removal of gender-affirming care and an increase of hostility toward transgender people continue as it is, we are going to see the number of those transgender people who end their life increasing substantially. We are going to see that. The removal of gender-affirming care accomplishes inflicting a condition of life that is calculated to bring about its physical destruction. This is calculated, by the way. This is calculated when studies show the number of suicidal ideations that are present in non-affirmed communities versus those in affirmed communities. Suicidal ideation drops dramatically when we look at people who have access to gender-affirming care and have affirming social networks. We see that suicidality drop when people are in a position when they are reminded that they are valid, that they are loved, and that they are wanted. But in those areas where they do not have access to care, where they do not have an affirming social network, those numbers increase. All we have to do is look at the ideas of the politicians currently where they reject the numbers that have been taken, that have been measured, that have been studied, that have been peer-reviewed, and they reject suicidality as inconsequential. That is inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about destruction. But also, let's look at discrimination against transgender and non-binary individuals. There are 27 states in the United States that currently have anti-discrimination legislation in place. There are laws in 27 states that specifically say you cannot discriminate against someone because they are part of the LGBTQ plus community. 27 states out of 50 protect LGBTQ plus people from discrimination. And when we talk about discrimination, we're talking about housing. We're talking about education. We're talking about financial loans so that people can take care of needs. We're talking about medical care. And as we continue to see states put into place religious freedom laws that allow medical professionals to deny access to non-life threatening care to someone based upon their moral, ethical, or religious beliefs, that discrimination now includes medical care. In addition to the outright laws that are keeping transgender minors and adults from accessing care in certain states. That discrimination is a life condition. That is a life condition that everyone needs. We need housing. We need education. We need access to medical care. Those are life conditions. And as we continue to see discrimination put in place, as we continue to see discrimination allowed in almost half of the United States, those life conditions and allowing that discrimination to continue with regard to those is a calculated effort. Because in the United States, all citizens Number 4 in the definition of genocide, according to the United Nations, is the imposing of measures intended to prevent births within the group. Now, this is not something that I'm going to argue because many individuals who begin transition medically understand this. They understand the sterilization process that comes when beginning medical transition. In fact, it is a part of the informed consent that we have to sign off on. We are told about the possible sterilization and the loss of fertility. We are informed that we will lose the ability to procreate. So we know this. But the interesting side effect of that is we have states that still require doctors' written testimony that a transgender person has had full surgical transition before they can update their documentation. Now, many states have removed that requirement, thank God. But the process of trying to update our identification papers in some states still requires intentional removal of sexual organs. Intentional removal of the ability to have children. Now, I want to say this. There are transgender people who choose to have children. And so they take the risks into account and they make provision for that possibility, and they are able to bring children into the world. This is why there is such a backlash against the discussion of trans men can be pregnant. Trans men can have children. Trans men do menstruate. The discussion here is a dismissal of their identity because reproductive function exists in the westernized Christian mindset as a part of the binary. Male and female, that's it. If you can have a baby, you are a female. If you are able to inseminate, you are a male. And the rejection of gender as a different type of classification of human existence gets in the way as people want to say the binary of sex, which isn't a binary when we include intersex people. But the binary of sex is also the binary of gender. As we look at this definition of imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, we recognize that as transgender people, we give up that privilege. But some still must prove it through surgical procedures. It's a weak argument, but it is real. Lastly, forcibly transferring children of that group identified into another group. More often than not, what we see here is the example of indigenous peoples in what we call North America and what many indigenous groups call Turtle Island. Residential schools and academies that were run by Christian organizations and churches were established so that indigenous children would be civilized, with full sarcastic quotes, according to the ways of white people. Those individuals who were sent to residential schools were children who were removed from their families. They were removed from their tribes and clans. They were removed from their sovereign nations and placed within these Christian-run, organized schools where circumstances were atrocious, where deaths, sexual assaults, and other forms of abuse were perpetrated on these children. The existence of mass graves outside of residential school areas is now being studied by different genocide watch groups, trying to determine the extent of the number of people impacted. When we talk about the transgender and non-binary community, we have to discuss the intentional effort to declare offering of gender-affirming care to minors as child abuse. In Texas, Governor Greg Abbott avoided legislation by making a declaration to the Department of Family and Protective Services and said that any family of a transgender child who was gaining gender-affirming care access for that child was to be investigated for child abuse. Many other states have written this into legislation, that if you offer gender-affirming care to a minor, it is child abuse. Some states have gone so far that if you are a medical professional and you participate in gender-affirming care for a minor, it is a felony, punishable by up to 10 years in prison and fines, removal of license, and refusal of being allowed to practice medicine in that state any longer. We're talking about the removal of children from affirming and caring families so that they would be placed most typically within the state system of, again, sarcasm font enabled child protective service systems. Sarcasm font disabled. Child protective services within many states are some of the least funded state organizations, especially organizations that are supposed to be protecting the welfare of children. We know of multiple states where abuses have been documented and where even deaths are attributed to the lack of oversight by the state departments. So we are taking children away from affirming and loving and caring parents and placing them within systems that are broken, dilapidated, and dangerous. We also have to look at what Florida is attempting to do through a piece of legislation. Florida is attempting to grant to the courts in that state the authority to amend custody agreements in an emergency order and issue what is essentially a warrant to take a transgender child into custody. According to how the law if it is passed, is written, it may also allow the courts to issue an emergency order in the case of a cisgender child being raised by a transgender parent. Now, this is typically in the case of divorce, but this could also be used in a case of families who may have some sort of guardianship agreement. Someone can go to the court, give proof that a child is receiving gender affirming care, and show the court that the parent is a transgender individual. The court would then issue an emergency order that would be equal to a warrant where the child, if they are in the state of Florida, can be taken into custody by the state. And the state would then determine whose custody that child would remain in. The reality is that there is no discussion of if that affirming parent, the parent who is caring for that gender affirming and or show the court that the parent is a transgender individual. The court would then issue an emergency order that would be equal to a warrant where the child, if they are in the state of Florida, can be taken into custody by the state. And the state would then determine whose custody that child would remain in. The reality is that there is no discussion of if that affirming parent, the parent who is caring for that gender affirming, that as long as this law is on the book, that parent could never gain custody of that child again, realistically speaking. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group is the fifth and final definition of a genocide by the United Nations. 3 of these definitions are currently operable when we talk about the transgender and non-binary community here in the United States. I'm willing to take questions at this point regarding the United Nations definitions. All right. Do you know if there's a move in the UN to update the groups? I do not know. I have not seen anything. I know that the United Nations have sent out independent observers who have watched what is happening with the LGBTQ plus community in numerous countries. I do know that the president of the UN actually declared that there is a problem and an emergency with many places where LGBTQ plus people are being targeted by unjust and potentially harmful laws and societal pressures. So I would hope that the United Nations is continuing to work on that. Let's see if I can find that real quick. Thank you, Greg. Blackfoot, Sioux, and Crow found dead at a school in Montana. Jesus. I'm not surprised that we're finally getting onto the discovering of the U.S. I'm not seeing anything right this moment on the United Nations, but I'll continue to look for that information. The United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner does identify that LGBTI people are exposed to various types of discrimination, including discriminated against in education, employment, and healthcare, mistreated and disowned by their own families, targeted for physical attacks and extreme violence, beaten, sexually assaulted, tortured, and killed. So, yeah, there is work looking at that in the United Nations, so we can only hope that that will continue. Any other questions on the United Nations definition? If not, I'm going to go ahead with the next part of the examination of genocide and how it impacts the transgender and non-binary community. As I said, that's okay, intolerant. The definitions by the United Nations have been met in terms of the acts that are committed against a group of people. Those acts in and of themselves do not happen in isolation. They are not just a spontaneous event where one day everything looks fine and the next day, boom, this thing happened. When we are looking at what constitutes a genocide, Dr. Gregory Stanton's 10 stages or 10 processes of genocide gives us a measuring stick. It gives us something that we can use to look at events that are happening in a place and understand those things in such a way, maybe as intervention steps. Every one of these that are identified offers us the opportunity to intervene and avoid coming to the end result of a legally defined genocide. Now, in each of these 10 stages or processes, we can begin to unpack that 9 of these are happening. 9 of these do seem to be in evidence. Now, some people are going to argue. Some people are going to say that, no, that's happening to other people. Individually, yes. And individually, I think that we do have to answer for all of these processes if they are targeted at a group of people, especially a group of people we identify as marginalized. When we talk about these 10 processes in relationship to the transgender and non-binary population, we have to look at the bulk, the continuity, the logical process as a whole that is taking place right now. Now, I've used this list before. I've gotten some of the language incorrect. So what I want to do is I want to go back through and I want to give you the definitions according to Dr. Stanton and allow you to hear what Dr. Stanton classifies each one of these processes as. Classification. All cultures have categories to distinguish people into us and them by ethnicity, race, religion, or nationality. For example, German and Jewish, Hutu and Tutsi. Bipolar societies that lack mixed categories, such as Rwanda and Burundi, are the most likely to experience a genocide. One of the most important classifications in the current nation-state system is citizenship in a nationality. Removal or denial of a group's citizenship is a legal way to deny that group's civil and human rights. The first step toward the genocide of the Jewish people and the Roma in Nazi Germany were the laws to strip them of their German citizenship. Burma's 1982 citizenship law classified the Rohingya as out of national citizenship. In India, the Citizenship Act denies a route to citizenship for Muslim refugees. Native Americans were not granted citizenship in the United States until 1924, after centuries of genocide that decimated their populations. So classification is that categorizing, that dividing of groups between what we would call binary identities. Have you noticed how much hate and rejection there is to the term cisgender? That in and of itself is classification. But what is missed in the aggravation of that term is that it is not transgender people classifying cisgender people. It is we have already been identified as outside. We have already been identified as something other than normal. How many people want to use the terms normal gender? I'm just a normal man, just a normal woman. How many want to use the term biological? I'm a biological man, I'm a biological woman. Or how many want to use that is the way things are? Meaning that man and woman is the default and transgender is an exception. You see, we are not forcing cisgender onto people. We have already had to accept the classification as transgender people as not normal, not in the default, and not biological. This isn't a matter of going back and trying to rectify the wrong. It truly is a matter of we've already been identified and classified as different, as outliers, as there is something wrong with us. And as we continue to see punitive psychiatry employed in the removal of modern understandings of gender dysphoria and a replacement of pathologization of gender identity, we are going to continue to see the removal of a sense of normal. In terms of citizenship, according to the United States Constitution, the 14th Amendment, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, Amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life. The Constitution says are our rights. That is denying our citizenship. Transgender people are having their citizenship removed, not because of a declaration saying you're no longer a citizen, but by the creating of laws that intentionally remove access to some of those rights that are guaranteed for others. But we are natural born and naturalized citizens, as well as members and citizens of the states that we live in. Secondly, symbolization. Dr. Stanton says, We give names or other symbols to the classifications. We name people Jews or gypsies, intending on that to be a slur, or we distinguish them by colors or dress and apply the symbols to members of groups. Classification and symbolization are universally human and do not necessarily result in genocide unless they lead to dehumanization. When combined with hatred, symbols may be forced upon unwilling members of pariah groups. The star for Jews under Nazi rule, the pink triangle for gay and transgender individuals, the blue scarf for people from the Eastern Zone in Khmer Rouge, Cambodia. With symbolization, we are seeing the effort to create a sense of those things that we identify as turned into a message saying that you are less than, you are other than. T slurs, F slurs, the use of the word queer in some places, the use of the word gay in some places. The declaration that the diversity flags, the LGBTQ flags, are somehow identified with a different identity that would then classify us as predators and pedophiles. This is the effort to take those symbols that mean something to us and turn them into a form of hatred, a form of invalidation. Our symbols that we use and we declare to be messages of peace, messages of reclaiming who we are now being used against us to continue to invalidate and create a predatory definition of who we are. Discrimination, according to Dr. Stanton, a dominant group uses law, custom, and political power to deny the rights of other groups. The powerless group may not be accorded full civil rights, voting rights, or even citizenship. The dominant group is driven by exclusionary ideology that would deprive less powerful groups of their rights. The ideology advocates monopolization or expansion of power by the dominant group. It legitimizes the victimization of weaker groups. Advocates of exclusionary ideologies are often charismatic, expressing the resentments of their followers. Examples include the Nuremberg Laws of 1935 in Nazi Germany, which stripped Jewish people of their German citizenship and prohibited their employment by government and university institutions. Discrimination against Native American, indigenous people, and African Americans within slavery was enshrined in the United States Constitution until Civil War amendments, and then after those who are African American in descent were released from slavery, the laws that continued until the mid-20th century. Denial of citizenship to the Rohingya Muslim minority in Myanmar led to genocide in 2017 and the displacement of over 1 million refugees. A dominant group using law, custom, and political power to deny the rights of other groups. The dominant group is driven by an exclusionary ideology that would deprive less powerful groups of their rights. Advocates of exclusionary ideologies are often charismatic, expressing the resentments of their followers. I really don't think I have to go into depth into what is happening with this. When we look at a dominant group, we know who that dominant group is that is fueling legislation. We know who that dominant group is who is influencing political representatives. We know who that dominant group is that is sending out advocates into all of the states to influence the transformation of living conditions within those states. I really don't need to go much more into that. Dehumanization. According to Dr. Stanton, one group denies the humanity of the other group. Members of it are equated with animals, vermin, insects, or diseases. Dehumanization overcomes the normal human revulsion against murder. At this stage, hate propaganda in print, on hate radios, and in social media is used to vilify the victim group. It may even be incorporated into school textbooks. Indoctrination prepares the way for incitement. The majority group is taught to regard the other group as less than human and even alien to their society. They are indoctrinated to believe that we are better off without them. The powerless group can become so depersonalized that they are actually given numbers rather than names, as Jewish people were in concentration death camps. They are equated with filth, impurity, and immorality. Hate speech fills the propaganda of official radio, newspapers, and speeches. When we look at the descriptors that opposition uses to talk about transgender and non-binary individuals, they reduce us down to being mentally ill. They reduce us down by saying that we identify with inanimate objects. Or they mock us by saying, well, I identify as a cat. Or kids are identifying as cats and dogs, wanting to use, litter boxes in classrooms. By depersonalizing and dehumanizing transgender and non-binary individuals, we continue to see a movement toward creating this idea of revulsion. The worst possible ways that this happen is through the identification and the ongoing misuse of the terms groomer and pedophile. These terms are consistently used in reference to LGBTQ plus people, specifically transgender individuals, by the opposition. And there are, even among our allies, mentalities of revulsion against those who are pedophiles. So even among our allies, it is recognized that the terms groomer and pedophile represent the worst of humanity. People who are not deserving to live. People who are not deserving to live in peace among others. Or we are used in such a way as sexual fetishes. We are reduced to our genitals. We are reduced to our sexual orientation that has no reference to our gender. We are minimized as only objects of sexual attention. Therefore, we are somehow removed from being full persons in terms of the full experience of humanity, and instead we are reduced to just products of sexual attention in terms of how this impacts our community. We know that among our demographic, survival sex is a necessity, meaning that individuals have to use sex work as a means of survival to gain the money or the resources that are needed to continue living. But others will look at us and they will reduce us to just the concept of a sexual object. We are accused of indoctrinating the children of the opposition, of telling them that they should join us, that they can be one of us, that they are a part of our group, and they should live into that, while at the same time ignoring their own indoctrination of hate against transgender people, ignoring their own efforts to dehumanize people by referring to them as mentally ill, pedophiles, or sexual objects. And we know that the major dominant opposition group considers us to be immoral, with no spiritual value unless we repent, change our ways, and live like them. And when it comes to looking at propaganda, I'm just going to call out one organization, Focus on the Family, which has been on the airwaves for decades. And I have heard multiple broadcasts from that organization that demonizes, invalidates, and dehumanizes LGBTQIA+ people. And right now they are part of that dominant group that seeks to dehumanize us. I also want to take a moment to note that the New York Times, one of the most famous papers in the United States, has also been guilty of biased and unfair reporting with regards to gender-affirming care and transgender people. Even when called to account for this bias, the New York Times has denied any wrongdoing. Organization. Genocide is always organized, according to Dr. Stanton, usually by the state, often using militias to provide deniability of state responsibility. Sometimes organization is informal or decentralized. Special army units or militias are often trained and armed. Plans are made for genocidal killings. Genocide often occurs during civil or international wars. Arms flows to states and militias facilitate acts of genocide. States organize secret police to spy on, arrest, torture, and murder people suspected of opposition to political leaders. Motivations for targeting a group are indoctrinated through mass media and special training for murderers, militias, death squads, and special army killing units. Now, we are not going to claim that militias are being trained. We're not going to claim that, that there are death squads or hit squads coming after us. But we cannot deny that according to the legislation that is being formed and the opportunity given to private citizens to turn in individuals, those do exist. In spite of efforts to counteract those, which have succeeded, but they will continue to happen. We have seen reporting pages on the internet. We have seen hotlines that people could call into. We have seen different ways that laws are written in such a vague way that transgender people could be targeted for police harassment, if not arrest, for just being in public in their presentation. We have seen targeted attacks on the drag community, as it is a performance art. Many of the ways that laws are written to decrease where drag performances can be held simply define it as in the presence of minors. That does not necessarily mean within a particular type of venue, and many of the laws that are written say explicitly for the purpose of performance or not. The way these laws are written would allow for police to be called and interact with an individual just because they are in public anywhere where a child or a minor could be present. And then there are bathroom laws. Bathroom laws that reject the civility and the safety of transgender people. The bathroom laws that are being established in some places sexualize the presence of transgender people. It creates the false assumption that they are there for any other purpose than the intended purpose of using the restroom. Bathroom laws have also been built upon a fallacy that transgender individuals are somehow predatory and violent, that they are a risk and a threat to the opposite gender. Their biological existence is used as a qualifying criminal existence, meaning that if you are born a biological male and you are in a women's restroom, just by your birth, you are now a criminal with regard to that. This is organized. This is an organized effort that is building upon a set of separate entities working together to create a block of political, legislative, and cultural influence. The organization of this is a combination of centralized and decentralized, because these groups do not meet together as one standing group, but instead they communicate with each other. The recent release of a set of emails that were obtained from different organizations that are behind anti-trans movements here in the United States shows that they are in communication with each other to do these very things that I'm talking about. To create legislation that would make the existence of transgender people illegal. And even when they had a member of the community among their own, they found a way to other that member of their community as a part of their organization and recognize that that person was just as culpable as any other transgender person, and that the laws should apply to them. This is an organized effort. It has gone back to the early parts of the 2010s. We have seen this movement growing in time and in monetary strength until they have the influence now not only to sponsor legislation, but also to influence the courts in such a way that rights can be removed from transgender people just by the right judges in the right places. Polarization is where extremists drive the groups apart. Hate groups broadcast polarizing propaganda. Laws may forbid intermarriage or social interaction. Extremist terrorism targets moderates, intimidating and silencing the center. Moderates from the perpetrator's own group are most able to stop genocide, so are the first to be arrested and killed. Leaders in targeted groups are the next to be arrested and murdered. The dominant group passes emergency laws or decrees that grants them total power over the targeted group. The laws erode fundamental civil rights and liberties. Targeted groups are disarmed to make them incapable of self-defense and to ensure that the dominant group has total control. Groups are being divided farther and farther apart. We see this in the way that the language is written within the legislation. They are not targeting transgender people. They are protecting the children, for whom transgender people are a threat, an influence that leads to harmful outcomes, debilitating, mutilating outcomes. The laws that are written in such a vague way to keep drag performers in certain forms of venues are vague enough to be enacted against transgender people to keep them off of the streets. Those who are targeting moderates are using the language that they use for us to force them into a categorization as one of us. The idea that Democrats are pedophiles, as one United States House of Representative mentions repeatedly, saying that the president himself is a pedophile. The use of language that would dehumanize an entire group of people who are not even identified with the group that is being targeted is polarization. It is the effort to move more people into the category to increase fear and hatred against the targeted category. The dominant group passes emergency laws or decrees that grants them total power over the targeted group. If you have not looked at the laws that are being passed, many cases in this year alone, those laws were declared an emergency, meaning that they needed to be enacted as quickly as possible as a means of protection against a group. Those anti-transgender laws would take away rights and access for transgender people. Those emergency laws are used to control the population who identify as transgender and non-binary. But also we see states such as Texas, such as Florida, and now we've seen Missouri declare emergency rules, emergency orders, and put into place legal discrimination, legal prohibitions against transgender people without passing through legislation. This has given the groups power to take away from us access to rights, access to equal living. This is not a legal law that was passed and signed off by an executive. This is an emergency order that was declared, ignoring all evidence to the contrary, to continue to subjugate transgender and non-binary individuals to the dominant group's power. Now, all of these that I've covered, classification through polarization, are considered othering, meaning that all of these are used to create the identified group that is being pushed out and targeted. Now what we are going to look at are the efforts to react to that othered group. In preparation, national or perpetrator group leaders plan a final solution, such as to the Jewish, Armenian, Tutsi, or other targeted group question. They often use euphemism to cloak their intentions, such as referring to their goals as ethnic cleansing, purification, counterterrorism. They build armies, they buy weapons, they train their troops and militias. They indoctrinate the populace with fear of the victim group. Leaders often claim that if we don't kill them, they'll kill us, disguising genocide as self-defense. There is a sudden increase in inflammatory rhetoric and hate propaganda with the objective of creating fear of the other group. Political processes such as peace accords that threaten the dominance of the ruling group through elections or prosecution for corruption may actually trigger genocide. We are seeing this. It is subtle. It is very slight, except for the inflammatory rhetoric that creates fear. Fear-mongering has increased greatly over the last 3 years. In the very beginning, it was barely a trickle, but now we see it coming from numerous sources. Most notably, we see one particular media outlet that loves to use inflammatory rhetoric to target transgender non-binary people. This one news source, one media outlet, has become sort of a magnet, drawing the attention of the dominant power and the opposition to transgender people and non-binary people. Michael Knowles is now known for his speech at CPAC, wherein he said that there is no middle ground when it comes to transgenderism, that the total eradication of transgenderism from every walk of life is a necessity. Michael Knowles has defended his statement, saying that he differentiates transgenderism from transgender people. But for everyone who is aware, transgenderism exists because transgender people exist. It is the state of being transgender that creates transgenderism, meaning that by our existence does transgenderism exist. The eradication of transgenderism is the call for the eradication of transgender people. Words like eradicate, eliminate, these are being thrown around by political and media operatives. They are being used in such a way to target transgender and non-binary individuals, to create a fear that we are somehow a threat and therefore action must be taken. There has been a very large opinion that somehow we are taking away the rights of others. That we are taking away the rights of women, that we are taking away the rights of girls, that we're taking away the rights of another group of people. And that covers up the fact that our rights are denied. We do not have a political power to take away rights. We do not have a concentrated effort to create some dominant transgender nation. The concept of transgender ideology, gender ideology, is the effort to give us more power than we actually have and say that we pose a threat to the good people of this country. Transgenderism, transgender ideology, the transgender agenda, all of these terms are used to make it seem like we have some great power that we possess that poses a threat to the operation of society as a whole. Once again, leaders will claim if we don't kill them, they will kill us, has pretty much been the unspoken rallying cry when it was used as transgenderism, transgender ideology, or the transgender agenda that needs to be stamped out. Persecution. Victims are identified and separated out because of their national, ethnic, racial, or religious identity. The victim group's most basic human rights are systematically violated through extrajudicial killings, torture, and forced displacement. Death lists are drawn up. In state-sponsored genocide, members of the victim groups may be forced to wear identifying symbols. Their property is often expropriated. Sometimes they are segregated into ghettos, deported to concentration camps, and confined to a famine-struck region and starved. They are deliberately deprived of resources such as water or food in order to slowly destroy the group. Programs are implemented to prevent procreation through forced sterilization or abortions. Children are forcibly taken from their parents. Genocidal massacres begin. All of these destructive acts of genocide are acts of genocide, and they are outlawed by the Genocide Convention. They are acts of genocide because they intentionally destroy part of the group. The perpetrators watch for whether such massacres are opposed by any effective international response. If there is no reaction, they realize they can get away with genocide. The perpetrators know that the UN, regional organizations, and nations with powerful militaries will again be bystanders and permit another genocide. We have seen that there are current genocides that are happening right now, and yet the major players in the world community are not acting to stop them. And these qualify under every definition of genocide. So if we as the transgender community begin to point out that there is a genocide happening among us, we are pretty certain to be overlooked. If they are overlooking the genocides of nations and people groups around the world, we are going to be overlooked. Are we being separated out? Well, it is transgender and non-binary care that is being eliminated. It is transgender and non-binary people who are being removed from athletics. We are seeing transgender children removed from affirming and caring parents. We are watching programs being implemented that force families to flee their home state. Why am I leaving Arkansas? Why am I leaving the South where I have grown up and spent most of my life, other than the laws that are being created to target me? This is where it begins, everyone. We have refugees within the United States fleeing from oppressive government. We have refugees within the United States fleeing from a dominant religious group enforcing their theocratic ideology into the laws of states and the nation. Transgender people are calling out for others to stop what is happening here. We are calling out for people to denounce these organizations and these associations that are trying to eradicate us. And they are watching the response. And they are increasing their efforts. Extermination is the legal definition of genocide, meaning that that is what lawyers will argue. It is an extermination because those who are in power will remove individuals because they do not believe they are fully human. When it is sponsored by the state, the armed forces often work with militias. The goal of total genocide is to kill all or as many members of a targeted group as possible. But most genocides are genocides in part. The educated members might be murdered. Men and boys of fighting age may be murdered. Women and girls may be sexually assaulted. Sometimes genocide results in revenge killing by groups against each other, creating a downward spiral. Destruction of cultural and religious property is employed to annihilate the group's existence from history. Total war between nations or ethnic groups is inherently genocidal because it does not differentiate between civilians from non-combatants, or does not differentiate civilians as non-combatants. Carpet bombing, firebombing, bombing hospitals, and use of chemical or biological weapons are war crimes, but also acts of genocide. Terrorism does not differentiate civilians and combatants, and when intended to destroy members of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, it is genocidal. Use of nuclear weapons is the ultimate act of genocide because it consciously intended to destroy a substantial part of a national group. This is not happening in large scale, but there are warm-ups to it. We know that transgender people are dehumanized to make it easier to end our existence. Trans-panic laws allow individuals in a heated moment of emotional overload to cause harm against transgender people, and they are allowed a reduction in sentence, if not total dropping of charges. The use of media outlets such as Libs of TikTok, The Daily Wire, and Fox News have led to bomb threats of hospitals that perform gender-affirming care, not based upon the care that they provide, but based upon the erroneous miscategorization of the care that they provide. Doctors have been threatened with assassination, having their licenses removed, being put in prison for assisting transgender and non-binary individuals to exist through medical interventions. Currently, in the state of Montana, Representative Zoe Zephyr is not allowed to speak within the House of Representatives to which she was duly elected. Representative Zephyr is the first out transgender woman in the Montana legislature, and her voice has been silenced because she stood in opposition to increasing laws that would remove access and rights for transgender people. When we finally get to a level of extermination that people will recognize, it will be too late. At that point, everything will be in place to stop it. The only thing that would be able to interfere with this happening would be an international intervention. Others coming together and saying that the lives of transgender and non-binary people are worth saving. Because as of right now, the United States has a full head of steam in moving toward this target. We are watching a genocide play out in front of our very eyes. And that brings us to the 10th process. Denial is the final stage that lasts throughout, and it also follows genocide. It is among the surest indicators of further genocidal massacres. The perpetrators of genocide dig up in the mass graves, burn the bodies, try to cover up the evidence, and intimidate the witnesses. They deny that they committed any crimes and often blame what happened on the victims. Acts of genocide are disguised as counterinsurgency if there is an ongoing armed conflict or civil war. Perpetrators block investigations of crimes and continue to govern until driven from power by force when they flee into exile. There they remain with impunity, such as Pol Pot or Idi Amin, unless they are captured and a tribunal is established to try them. During and after genocide, lawyers, diplomats, and others who oppose forceful action often deny that these crimes meet the definition of genocide. They call them euphemisms like ethnic cleansing instead. They question whether the intent to destroy a group can be proven, ignoring thousands of murders. They overlook deliberate imposition of conditions that destroy part of a group. They claim that only courts can determine whether there has been a genocide, demanding proof beyond a reasonable doubt, when prevention only requires action based on compelling evidence. While I was preparing for this morning, I encountered a couple of articles that I wanted to share with you all. From the Daily Signal, if transgender rhetoric isn't stifled, expect more violence from left. Genocide, it's a word designed to evoke images of the worst atrocities of the 20th century and force people into action. We must prevent those evil Republicans from passing bills preventing children from taking hormone blockers or getting mastectomies. In the critics' warped view, it's all to prevent a trans Holocaust. Except this isn't 1940s Germany, and there's no actual genocidal campaign against transgender people. In truth, transgender propaganda permeates our pop culture. Businesses are falling all over themselves to demonstrate their fealty to the alphabet group, and teachers secretly groom children with LGBT ideology. Far more often, accusations of hatred and bigotry against transgender people are in actuality just refusals to completely acquiesce to the activists' insane demands. That was from the Daily Signal. The writer is Douglas Blair. And this article comes from the Paradox Institute. There is no trans genocide, written by Talia Nava. It is often claimed by many trans activists that genocide is being committed against the trans community via anti-trans laws. More recently, Anne Fausto Sterling, a biologist and trans activist, made the very argument in a post made on Twitter and Mastodon. Accusations of genocide are very serious and they should not be used without good reason. This begs the question, is genocide being committed against the trans community? The writer then goes into the United Nations definitions of genocide, such as I did. And they go through those definitions, counteracting every point of them, much as I have shown how they are being committed. The conclusion of the article is this: who is committing genocide? The claim of genocide by trans activists like Anne Fausto Sterling appears to have no legs to stand on. For one, there is no clear intent to commit genocide against trans people, but additionally, the trans community is not of any particular nationality, ethnicity, race, or official religion. Although one could argue that transgender ideology is a religion, it is not a recognized religious group. But if one could prove intent, who is actually committing acts that would qualify as genocide? Who is promoting treatments that don't prevent suicide in trans people while simultaneously calling treatments that help trans people conversion therapy? Who is promoting treatments that eliminate and prevent births and pregnancy in trans individuals? Who is removing children from families who question if these treatments are worth the harmful side effects? It appears the group that is most harmful to trans identity or trans identifying individuals are the activists who claim to be protecting them. Those articles represent the very twisting of the narrative to create the doubt that is necessary to say this is not a genocide. Those articles are only part and parcel of the overall propaganda effort that dehumanizes and invalidates transgender and non-binary people to the point that all of these processes happen freely, legally. In conclusion, I don't know if I have offered anything to anybody. For the most part, I've been preaching to the choir, folks who already support and affirm and care and fight. I don't know that anybody is ever going to watch this, or anywhere in the world anybody is going to get anything from this. But as a historian, somebody who has read widely on the events of the past, as social groups, I do not have hope that this will be avoided in its entirety. I do not see an outcome that is positive that would avoid all of these being fulfilled in the worst possible ways. And it may be denied, it may be countermanded, it may be ripped apart by others, but I am convinced that this is happening right now within the United States. This is happening with the very clear cooperation of multiple societal groups. Transgender people are being targeted for genocide. According to the United Nations, according to the 10 processes that have been identified by Dr. Gregory Stanton, we can clearly see an effort to remove transgender people, in part, if not in whole, from the public sphere. Thank you all very much for sticking with me. I know it was long. I know it was a lot to sit through. I appreciate you doing that. And if you all would like to ask questions, I would. Entertain questions that are legitimate.